women at midlife are often in this period where we neglect our health across the board. You're taking care of aging parents, maybe you're taking care of kids. You perhaps aren't getting that regular contact with your gynecologist because you're past your reproductive, age. That midlife period is such a primo time for you to not only be making these appointments with doctors across specialties to check up on things, but also to create a proactive plan, right? Because the changes you make in your 40s and your 50s when it comes to diet, exercise, sleep, all these lifestyle pillars, that's when you're going to see the payoff later on. But it's going to take making changes in midlife for that to happen.
Meghan, I'm curious, when we talk about the old rules, the way that women's health was kind of approached in the past and what has failed us, are there 2 or 3 things when you reflect back on writing this book that you think is improving, like going from things that failed us in the past, that maybe there's a shift in the way that we are approaching not just the trajectory of, a lot of what we talk about on this podcast is perimenopause, but that trajectory of a woman's lifetime?
Yeah, I think we are at an exciting time where more research is being done. So yes, we still have a long way to go, but after interviewing the number of experts I did, there is a hopeful vibe. There is a sense that, yeah, we're working hard to make up for lost time, but what we're finding is helping us in the clinic. It's helping us care for patients. And so I think that's first and foremost really exciting. I mean, I'm sure you see this as well, where you're like, wow, we can do things differently now because we have more knowledge. And I think a lot of practitioners are also just doing amazing work educating us about this, right? Because I think historically women haven't really gotten an education about our bodies, which is really sad when you think about it. I'm 46 years old, and to spend 46 years in this body and really not have a solid grasp on a lot of basic concepts is sad. I think we fail our kids in health class by just skimming the surface and leaving a lot to be desired when it comes to the kind of detail we go into. But I think that's changing. Again, yeah, we have a ways to go, but let's take a stop along the path and say, wow, at least we've come this far.
Absolutely. I mean, I was talking to one of my boys about what health class was like back in the 1980s. And because I was born in the 70s, raised in the 80s and 90s. And I said, it's no different now that they still separate genders, but it was very much focused on, you're going to have this period and these are the things you do to address the period. It was very much, we call it bikini medicine, but so focused on just menstruation, which of course, when you're 4th or 5th grade, you're horrified by the concept of dealing with that. But I think now there's definitely greater awareness, or, making it all transactional, like, oh, well, you're in high school. So, that's when the Just Say No campaign was out. And, you can imagine the poor health teachers having to explain to all these very hormonal teenagers, like, just say no to sexual intercourse. But, oh, by the way, there's also things you can do to prevent pregnancy. But that was like the most limited information that was shared at school. And so it's been interesting to me as a parent and a clinician to be able to kind of observe how things are starting to change, hopefully in a very positive way, as more research, frankly, more research dollars are being driven into women's health, number one. And then number two, kind of the trickle-down effect that I was doing a survey last night online, and I stumbled upon a video for a very prominent actress talking about how embarrassed she was that her fiance was noticing she had an estrogen patch on. And there was this whole unpacked conversation about how, it triggered this whole discussion and how supportive this individual was. And I was like, gosh, things are changing, because no one would have ever brought that up before.
No, and I think it's such a great point. We are at a cool point in time where a lot of the topics that my mom and her friends would never have talked about with each other, with their daughters, we're all talking about now, right? Like, again, at 46, if I'm out with girlfriends, if I'm at a cocktail party, for sure, like gory details come up, and it's great. You know, we're talking about painful sex and dry vaginas and hot flashes, and you know, these are just normalized now, and it's amazing, right? Because we're like, a couple nights ago I was at a you know, gathering with girlfriends, and someone was like, sex is really painful. Like, who should I call? What should I do? What doctor appointment should I make? You know, and it's like, cool. Like, how great that we can be sitting next to each other among other women talking about that.
Right. Well, and I mean, the fact that my kids, well, again, I have young adult male sons, and they heard me talking about vaginal estrogen, and they were like, here she goes again about vaginal estrogen. I said, guys, here's the thing. It should be over the counter. Like, it is something that, you know, we have a free Facebook group, and there, and it's like regularly women will say, why am I suddenly starting to get a lot of urinary tract infections? And I was like, two words: vaginal estrogen. Please talk to your provider. And they were like, well, I thought that was just for old ladies. And I was like, no. In many instances, you know, this fixes a lot of symptomatology, you know, painful sex, chronic urination, pelvic floor issues, and destigmatizing the conversation around our family, but also the fact that you're noticing your girlfriends are comfortable bringing these subjects up says a lot, because women in many instances have suffered in silence. Certainly my mother's generation, I don't even know when my mother went into menopause, and she's a retired nurse. It was just very shameful to talk about the end of your fertility, whereas now I think women celebrate it like, woo-ha, no more periods, no more worrying about, you know, ruining pants, no more worrying about having to carry stuff with me. There's a whole new freedom that comes with no longer having menstrual cycles.
Yeah, and I think we as daughters are talking to our moms proactively. Like, I said to my mom after doing a lot of reporting for this book in the menopause chapter, Mom, are you on vaginal estrogen? And she blushed a little. You know, we don't typically go into, and but I was like, you got to talk to your doctor about it pronto. Like, this is, you know, essential skincare. You can think about it for women postmenopause, and now she's on it. You know, how great is that? That, like, again, we're starting to take some of these formerly taboo topics and just be like, no, we're going to talk about it. And we're going to talk about it with dad sitting over there too, you know, which is great.
No, it's really important. When you think about midlife issues that you discuss in the book, whether it's brain changes, cardiovascular risk, autoimmunity, menopause, what do you think are the most under-recognized or under-acknowledged after speaking to all these experts? And again, as I stated before multiple times, it's so nice to see such a broad swath of people in the book, many of whom are people that are at the top in their fields.
Yeah, I feel like the first thing that comes to mind is something Dr. Lisa Larkin said to me, which is, you know, women at midlife are often in this, you know, period where we neglect our health across the board. You're taking care of aging parents, maybe you're taking care of kids. You perhaps aren't getting that regular contact with your gynecologist because you're past your reproductive, you know, age. And, you know, the dog gets more vet appointments than you get doctor visits. The focus is out, not on yourself. And so I think, you know, when she talked to me about this, it resonated. And also what she said is really remarkable, which is, you know, that midlife period is such a primo time for you to not only be making these appointments with doctors across specialties to check up on things, but also to create a proactive plan, right? Because the changes you make in your 40s and your 50s, when it comes to diet, exercise, sleep, all these lifestyle pillars, that's when you're going to see the payoff later on. But it's going to take making changes in midlife for that to happen. And so I think first and foremost, if you're a woman in midlife, it's like, it's time to prioritize your health. Like, check up on where you're at with your screenings. When was the last time you had a primary care appointment? And really prioritize that for yourself.
No, that sandwich generation, which I didn't fully appreciate until last year. My father got sick, and I was literally thinking, I've got one son who's graduating from high school, and that's a wonderful, exciting time, along with my father having a healthcare hiccup and passing away in the midst of, you know, so many of the conversations I have with women that they're like, my responsibilities are so vast. I'm taking care of aging parents. I'm taking care of teenagers or young adults. I've got, you know, my business is more established. I have more responsibilities. And more often than not, what happens is we take care of everyone else instead of ourselves. And it feels almost a little indulgent when you're like, oh, I've got to take time out of my workday to go get my mammogram or a pelvic exam or colonoscopy. In the past 6 weeks, I've had 2 out of those 3, just being a responsible citizen. But with that being said, I think for a lot of women, it's giving them permission to prioritize themselves. I know, I spent 16 years in clinical cardiology. We know women present later with disease. They generally have small vessel disease. And it's because they're taking care of everyone else and they diminish their symptoms because they're like, oh, I've got one more thing I have to do for someone else. We're such givers in general. And so, what were some of the, common themes that clinicians and researchers were echoing about empowering women to take care of themselves throughout their trajectory of their lifetime?
First and foremost is knowledge. So you bring up cardiology, which is another huge area where women, by and large, are maybe not focused on in the midlife period where we really could be, and it could help us so much later on. So in interviewing preventive cardiologists, I found out something that really was sad, which is that as women, our awareness of heart disease being the number one killer, our number one killer, is going down. We're worried about breast cancer. We're worried about, colon cancer, these cancers that are important to be on our radar, yes? And we need to be embracing the fact that heart disease isn't this disease of old men where they're, clutch. Exactly. And so the thing about heart disease as well, which was another eye-opener, which I don't think enough women know, is that gynecologic issues like a history of hot flashes in menopause, and even before that, in pregnancy complications can alert you. That should be a red flag to be like, I need to talk to my doctor about this, and possibly even a preventive cardiologist to say, look, this is in my history. What can I be doing to be like an A+ student on the preventive side of things when it comes to cardiology and my heart health?
It's such an important point because I think women don't make the connection that pregnancy is like a stress test for the body. So whether it's preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, eclampsia. So for listeners, preeclampsia, eclampsia is, this pregnancy-induced high blood pressure, which is not benign. But I think about gestational diabetes, I think about PCOS and how those can be signs of people who are perhaps less metabolically healthy, more likely to go on and develop atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And what I find interesting, and on my platform, I talk about this a lot, but to your point, we sometimes are so focused on cancer screenings, which is appropriate. I'm not diminishing that. But if 1 in 3 women is going to die of heart disease, we need to be thinking about this and actually thinking about it in our 30s, 40s, and 50s because, we maybe aren't thinking of what life is going to be like when we're 70, 80, or 90. And I can tell you from clinical experience that women generally present differently. We don't have the classic symptoms that men experience. We could just be short of breath. I remember I had a nun that I took care of, and she just had pain in her left hand. It was something so nonspecific. And so I remember running an EKG and I was like, oh my God, this little 75-year-old nun is having a heart attack, but her symptoms are not crushing chest pain and shortness of breath. It is pain in her hand. So it can be that nuanced. And why I love that, there was such thoughtfulness into the clinicians that were selected for the book and making sure that it was a really kind of cohesive conversation around different parts of the body to help people better understand what to be looking out for.
Yeah, Cynthia, I had a really cool experience I was mostly done with the reporting of this book, and I had a new doctor appointment, a new primary care physician, and I was in the clinician's office in my little paper gown, talking to her about my health, and I'm telling you, her eyes started to sparkle. She just had this look of excitement, and she said to me, she's like, this has been such a fun visit because you're coming with such a baseline knowledge that we can cover more ground. We can talk about more nuanced aspects of your care and what I recommend for you because you're coming again with that baseline knowledge and interest. And I feel like that really is my hope, is that if you do decide, you know what, it's time to see a cardiologist. Maybe I had some preeclampsia or gestational diabetes, and even if it went totally away, it cleared up completely after a baby was born, that's a sign. You should probably bring it up. Not probably, definitely bring it up with a doctor, right? But before you go to that cardiology visit, tuck into the cardiology, the heart health chapter, so you just have a little bit more of a lay of the land, because for those of us who don't go, to years of schooling like you do and like our clinicians do, we don't really get an education about this. And so we need to get informed on our own to be our own best advocates.
And one of the things I think is always really valuable when I interview journalists, writers, you have a fresh perspective. You're looking at this as someone that is not a trained clinician, but you have a very interesting angle. And that piece about like read the chapter before you go to a meeting with a neurologist, a cardiologist, or your internist, it just gives you some insights and a backbone of questions and kind of conversation facilitation. As a writer, what do you think has contributed to the lack of research dollars spent on women? And I mean, we could talk about how research dollars came to a screeching halt, well, not before my lifetime, in my lifetime, but in 1993, kind of research dollars opened back up. But what do you think has contributed to this kind of lack of emphasis and focus? Do you think it's just this lack of awareness around the unique aspects of women's care? Because, for most of our lifetime, we have a menstrual cycle, which confounds, the researchers. But from your perspective, what has contributed to this lack of research?
Yeah, I think it's been a number of factors. Many of them you brought up. It's like women were considered for a long time, as Stacey Sims says, small men. We are not small men is what Stacey Sims has been tremendous at spreading the news about. But for a long time, that was the assumption. And so women are harder to study. And so if we just study men, we'll gain insights to help us take care of females as well. I think also, we live in a patriarchal society. And I think that has spread throughout all of society, including what we research, what we deem worthy of research. And I also think, too, it's been shockingly recent that we have learned that bikini medicine isn't all there is for women. There was such a focus on our breast health, our gynecologic health, our reproductive health, and not nearly enough understanding or focus placed on the fact that we have different brains, we have different hearts, and some of these differences are subtle. But there just wasn't an emphasis placed on let's understand those subtle differences to help care for the women.
Well, and it's interesting to me because I reflect on how the terminology around estrogen, progesterone, testosterone has started to shift, not wanting to call them sex hormones because it goes, to your point, to this kind of bikini medicine concept, but understanding these hormones have effects throughout our body. And so helping women understand that whether it's hormone replacement therapy or just understanding basic physiology, this is why women get brain fog when their estrogen levels are not optimal. This is why women have trouble sleeping when their progesterone starts to falter. This is why women will experience a change in their executive function skills when testosterone is faltering. And it's beyond just sex hormones, although it's convenient to call them that. I think the new vernacular is pet hormones, so progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. But I'd be the first person to say it's like any other hormone in the body. It really does have systemic effects.
Yeah, I've seen that. And I love that there's this renaming going on. Like, words matter. How we talk about our bodies and our health really does matter. I start the book with an anatomy chapter, and there's a group of anatomists who are saying, look, a lot of the body parts, the names we use for various organs are actually named after men who maybe didn't even discover the organ, but just laid claim to it. So fallopian tubes is a great example of this. That's an eponym named after an old Italian priest whose last name was Fallopio. And that's why we call them the fallopian tubes. And so this new group of anatomists, largely female, are saying, look, let's call them uterine tubes. It not only helps us, get rid of that old sexist way of medicine and how we used to practice medicine, but also it's easier to learn, for clinicians like yourself, memorizing anatomy. it cuts down on cognitive load, which I think is amazing. And so to your point too, this rebrand of sex hormones, I'm here for it. I think when it comes to hormones in particular too, there's a quote that's in my book that opens the chapter on hormones from Dr. Elizabeth Coleman, who is just remarkable. This is from her book, All in Her Head. And she says, culturally, women receive the message that hormones make them moody, volatile, and incompetent, while also receiving little to no real education about the impact of hormones on their bodies. And so that's the thing too, it's like our hormones in particular, man, we even blame our moods and our emotions ourselves. I've been, blaming my hormones for years. And it's like, wait a second, hormones are remarkable. If you have a little bit of information about how they work in the body, we would revere them versus blame them for feeling a little annoyed, or sad.
Well, and it's like once you understand that they're chemical messengers designed to deliver information, it's like, oh, wow, wait a minute, they're really powerful. And I think we've just been conditioned that hormones make us emotional, hormones make us moody. It's like we just keep blaming, but it's really our body's way of trying to communicate information. And I think if we find that reframe, like I know when I talk to younger women, it's like, let's find the reframe. It's our body's way of communicating information. And if you think about it that way, I think it makes it a little bit more tolerable as opposed to thinking like we're at war with our hormones. It's like, let's do the things that make sense to us depending on where we are in our cycle, depending on where we are in our life stage. And when we're in alignment with those things, our life is so much easier.
Yes. And I think, thankfully we're starting to talk about menopause more. And I think we're starting to revere that transition rather than saying like, ugh, like all my hormones are dropping precipitously. And, it's like, okay, yeah, but like how lucky am I to get to go through menopause because I'm still alive. I'm here. This is a very natural transition. And what I'm trying to do is that reframe for myself. And I think we're collectively starting to do that, which is like, okay, like, yeah, this is a natural process of hormones going crazy through perimenopause and then settling into their new low state postmenopause. But like, cool, how can I work with that? How can I know what's happening so that I can understand I'm not going crazy. These are symptoms based on hormones changing. And then you can have much better conversations with your doctor because, you have an awareness of what's happening versus like, just give me all the medicine. You can say like, hey, this is what's happening. These are my symptoms. What do you think? It helps us have these conversations with clinicians like yourself where we go into, what shared decision making, true shared decision making.
Which is what's key, because I think about how, like my generation, I always use this as an example, and I say this lovingly. Like we never had conversations if we would put on oral contraceptives about like what do oral contraceptives, long-term effects of like bone health and other things. This may magnify PMS that you're experiencing when you actually don't have bad PMS. And so I'm not saying not to use contraception. That's not the point. But I think now there's a more open conversation with most clinicians saying like, here's the pros and cons. Based on this, what do you think is the best decision for me or for us to make together? Which that shared decision-making piece was not part of the conversation 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Totally. And I think, we are in a time where we are bombarded with health information, and there are upsides of that and there are downsides of that, right? I think it's on all of us to really do our homework. And I think every woman can be a health journalist in her own life when it comes to using the skills that I use as a journalist, that we do as journalists to really assess information, understand what the consensus is, understand how and work with an expert as to how that information might work into our own lives. But yeah, it's, we're coming to our doctors more informed. And I think by and large, that's a great thing. It's helping us have better conversations to make those decisions that end up helping us and on our health.
What do you think about the influence and the rise of social media? Like as a writer, as a fellow middle-aged woman, is it, I think there's good and bad as an interplay, but from your perspective, while you were writing this book, I'm sure there were some influences on social media that were influencing conversations you were having with experts.
Oh, totally. And it's both, it really is. I think there are a lot of doctors who are on Instagram right now and other clinicians and nurse practitioners researchers who are doing tremendous work when it comes to health education. I follow a number of these clinicians, and it's remarkable because I would never be able to get an appointment, whether it's because of location or they're really busy and they don't have room in their practice, but I can learn from them. It's interesting, when I was at that gathering with friends and I was talking about vaginal estrogen to a friend who's a little bit older, who was like, she said to me, "Ugh, I don't want to use it. It's so messy." And I was like, you know what you need to do? Follow this doctor, Corinne Men, on Instagram. She has this really cool tutorial about how you could ditch the applicator and use your finger, and she goes through it step by step. And how wonderful is that? I think the risk comes in with when you're following someone who's not trained like you are, or like Dr. Corinne Men, so you really have to do your homework as a consumer. Again, like I do as a health journalist, like, what are this person's credentials? Does it say sponsored or ad? Are they getting paid to talk about something? Which not necessarily bad, but just is important to know. And then what's the consensus? Like, is what this person saying what a lot of other doctors and healthcare practitioners in the same space are saying? And so it's, I think, by and large, great, because it's having all of us talk about these really important topics about our health, and to sort through the chaos of misinformation that's out there and the overwhelm. It's on us to do a little homework before we believe the information, and also before we continue to spread it.
Yeah, I think that point about being discerning, about, questioning, like, I'm always someone that will say, well, that's interesting. I might go do some research on what someone had suggested. And it's not to suggest, by no means am I saying you can be out there and not be sharing helpful information if you don't have credentials after your name. I'm not saying that at all, because there are plenty of people that I find fascinating and interesting who challenge the status quo, but tend to be very evidence-based. They tend to share the research, they talk about it, or they'll say, this is the power of the N of one. This works for me, but this may not work for everyone else, but I want to share this in case this would be helpful to someone else. And so I think, irrespective of what platform you're on, just kind of keeping that in mind. Sometimes where I find social media to be the most rigidly dogmatic is around nutrition. And that is, if this worked for me, I'm going to extrapolate this to everyone. And so I sometimes will say, well, this is a great example of, if you want to try the carnivore diet, try it out and see how you feel. I think that's completely reasonable. Doesn't mean it's what you do forever. Maybe not. Maybe transiently we're trying different things. It's like a grab bag of trying different strategies to find out what works for you lifestyle wise.
Totally. And in an ideal scenario, you've got a clinician you're working with who you can run this by, right? It's like, that's what I think too, is like, when I get information, I then call 3 experts in the field to understand what their take is. You want a consensus, right? Before I write an article about something as fact, I want to see the research, and I want to make sure the experts in the field are saying, yeah, here's how to make sense of it for the general public. And I think we can all do that, right? It's like, I am on social media and I see things, and then at my next doctor visit, I say, hey, I saw this. I want to know if I'm a candidate. I want to know what you think. Is it right for me? And so I do think, every clinician I interviewed for this book, they want to have those conversations with their patients. You can speak to this, Cynthia, right? It's like, you want to be this integral player. It's not like you're just saying, do as I say. It's like, you want the conversation. And I think when we as women know that, like, it can make us more excited to go see our practitioners.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. This morning is a good example. I have a shared patient, a lovely woman, and I gave her my opinion of her labs. And then her clinician had a different opinion about 2 things. And so I said, this is a great example of, you can both be in the right and have differing opinions on when to intervene about thyroid or about low testosterone. And I said, this is someone who's probably a little bit more conservative in terms of clinically, and that's okay. It's not that one is right and one is wrong. I would probably intervene a little sooner based on your symptoms, but I think it's totally okay to say, let's wait and see how things go in the short term.
Yeah, I love that. And I think for all women listening to this, it's like, go ahead and bring your notebook to your doctor. Go ahead and interview, so to speak, a number of clinicians when you're trying to find solutions for what's troubling you. I had a hysterectomy earlier this year, and I interviewed, I would say, 3 different surgeons before I landed on the one that felt like the right fit for me. And I brought my reporter's notebook and I was asking questions. And I just feel like we should feel empowered to be able to get second and third opinions when it comes to our bodies and these really big decisions we're making about our health.
Absolutely. Do you feel like your experiences writing this book kind of set you up to feel more empowered to do that? Bring your writer's book and be doing questions and answering with each surgeon.
Absolutely. Even as a health journalist, I can't tell you the number of times my jaw was dropped when I was interviewing your colleagues for this book, because we just miss some things, and there's a lot to know about our health and our female bodies. And so, yes, I learned a lot when it came to the anatomy of the uterus, the different options that there tend to be in certain cases when it comes to hysterectomy. So as one, Dr. Lauren Stryker put it, it's kind of an a la carte surgery where you can have different organs removed, again, based on your symptoms. I had a uterus full of fibroids, super common, and they were creating really bad menstrual symptoms for me, and interestingly enough, symptoms that I ignored for years, just kind of chalking them up to hormones. And I was like, well, I'm probably in perimenopause, and that's why I'm hemorrhaging, quote unquote, for a couple days. Crime scene periods. And it's like, finally working on this book, I was like, oh, I don't think I should be just brushing these symptoms off as no big deal, especially given I was borderline anemic and sort of, if I turned over the wrong way in bed, I would get dizzy. Like my hair was falling out in clumps. Like these are things that I think as women we're just like, I can buck up, buttercup, but working on this book really helped me understand, okay, there are some general guidelines for sort of what's normal and what's not, what to raise a flag about with your doctor. And then understanding what surgeries like hysterectomy, which is an incredibly common surgery, what they entail, just helped me ask better questions and show up at those appointments with various surgeons feeling really confident, and empowered to sort of say, okay, I hear you, I'm going to think about this.
Well, and I think it's also going into it feeling empowered versus fearful, because I think in many instances when I talk to women who are considering undergoing either a total or a partial hysterectomy, there's a great deal of fear. I think there's the fear of the unknown, but there's also the fear of, like, if I lose my reproductive organs, does that make me less of a female? Which I think is so sad, because if you're suffering, like clearly you were suffering, you're anemic, you're dizzy, you're uncomfortable, you had a constellation of symptoms, it is absolutely the right decision to make.
Yeah, and it was my decision, right? And I think that's the thing. And I think also I learned a big lesson in the importance of holding space for all of it. So I showed up at those appointments with surgeons confident, but I left those appointments still feeling sad and scared. And I think when something big happens with our bodies, there's this sense that our body has betrayed us, and I'm healthy, I exercise, I eat right, I don't drink, and here I am taking all these steps for my health, and still I have a uterus full of fibroids. Like, what's going on, and so I think it was a real process of learning to just be able to hold multiple emotions, like this is the right decision, as well as, gosh, what's it going to mean for me not to have my womb, as a woman? And it's fair. All of it's fair and game.
Absolutely. You have written pieces like 5 questions doctors wish every patient would ask. What questions do you feel like you wish more women would ask clinicians, especially around hormones and midlife?
I think most doctors I've talked to wish more women in midlife would come with that notebook or note app on their phone with the symptoms that they're going through, like, what is your story? And then not only that, but like to do as I do as a health journalist, the journalism 101, you're going to learn, don't bury the lead. It means start with what's most important, Or what do you feel is impacting you the most? And so I think that has been really eye opening. Like, it's, doctors want to hear your story and they want to hear what's going on, and they've heard it all. So don't be embarrassed. Don't feel shame. Don't apologize for your female body.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's really interesting to me that even as a clinician myself, probably 10 years ago when my cycles were incredibly heavy and I was, I used to call it affectionately the crime scene periods, but I was not exaggerating. And I'm not even sure my GYN understood how heavy my cycles were. And it just so happens that my annual exam was on the first day of my cycle starting. And so she went to do an internal exam and she was like, "Oh my God, your period is so heavy." And I was like, "I've been telling you that." And she said, "But you didn't tell me how heavy." And I said, "Well, I wasn't kidding." But I think for a lot of people, even as a clinician, there's a degree of like discomfort or embarrassment, or you don't want to see like you're being burdensome by sharing, but they want to hear it all. Like, we want to know how bad it is so that we can help you, because there's a very different conversation if you're having very heavy cycles versus someone who's having terrible brain fog. Like, those are two very different ways to approach those symptoms. And so the more that we feel comfortable and empowered, the more likely we are to get better help and be able to get to a solution faster.
Totally. And it's interesting because I feel like what I also heard from doctors is compare your symptoms to something else. Like when I realized how heavy my periods were, it was when I started saying out loud, I have to wear an overnight pad and change that overnight pad every hour for the first 2 to 3 days of my period. And like that makes a clinician go, whoa, yeah, you quantify it. And like I've interviewed pain specialists who say, look, if something hurts, compare it to something else that, might put it into context. So it's like, this pain hurts as badly as childbirth, labor during childbirth, or I am in as much pain as I was when I tore my ACL playing soccer in high school, And so really being specific can help our practitioners help us, right?
Yeah, I love data is the way. Like, I will oftentimes say to patients that if you can quantify what you're experiencing, it gives me a better, like a more objective way of me fully understanding. I can recall when I was rounding on patients, I would pray my period wouldn't start because there was not enough tampon, like super tampon and a big pad in the hospital. I would bleed through it in an hour. And when you're in scrubs, you have very little to no ability to hide what's happening. So I agree with you that the quantification is really important. I think that, when women feel dismayed, gaslit, I mean, hopefully there's less of that now. What's one kind of concrete thing that you would encourage them to do at their next appointment? Now, sometimes we can just change providers. That might be the first way to deal with that. But what's another way to bring greater awareness to these symptoms where we feel like our own experiences are not being taken seriously?
I think the biggest thing I learned in writing this book is to slow it way down. Like in any situation, in interpersonal situation where things are going in a direction where you're not really psyched, try to slow it way down. And that is really hard to do. Let's call a spade a spade. There's a power differential when we are in a room with someone who has way more training and potentially a lot more confidence than we do in talking about bodies. I recently came across a quote that I love, which is, doctors know bodies and you know your body. And I think if we can slow things down to remember, like, okay, let me take a deep breath. I know the symptoms I'm going through. Maybe I can try a different way of expressing those symptoms. Maybe I can name outright, I feel like you're not really hearing me. Like, can we start again? Just to at least give it a try, because a lot of times we don't have a lot of choice. Some women don't have a lot of choice in who we see, or time to make that other appointment, time to take off from work to get to that appointment, And so as much as we can, not that it's right that you feel that way, but if we can slow it down and just try to get our point across, I think that can be at least step one.
No, I like that. And I think the language, like the language that we choose to use when we're communicating with clinicians is very important. I was always someone that no matter what a patient said to me, I took it seriously. But I used to always say you could tell someone that was being very thoughtful with the choices of words they were using because they really do want it to be a collaborative conversation and not one where you're demanding. Now, in a non-urgent situation, we can do that, right? If someone's dealing with an urgency or an emergency, that's different. But in these other situations, as you astutely mentioned, you have these power differentials. There's lack of familiarity with some of the terminology that might be used. And this is really where I think therapeutic communication, you'd be surprised how often if you just slow things down and also just be mindful of the words that you're using, like saying, can you help me understand? Like I used to find when patients would say that to me, I was like, okay, I need to take things back 1,000-fold and explain it in a way that's making it more accessible, even though I was doing a good job. But I think in many, many instances, that's really what we're trying to do is better understand so that we can then make an educated next step.
Yeah, and I think, I interviewed a doctor for a section of the book on how to make the most of a short appointment because a lot of times we feel it's huge, right? A lot of times we feel a little bit rushed or we feel like, really, you got 15 minutes for my annual appointment? I got 10 things that I want to talk about or 20 things I want to talk about. And what she said to me was, I think, really remarkable, which is come to your appointment with all the list. Then prioritize that list and actually say to your clinician, I have a feeling we're not going to be able to cover all of this. And here's the full list. Here's what I think is most important. Like, what do you think? What do we have time to cover here? And she said, that helps me know that you get it. By and large, clinicians want to spend a lot more time with us. Like in an ideal world, you'd get to spend an hour plus, I'd say, with all of your patients. And that's just not always feasible, right? It's in most cases it's not. And so if you show up with an understanding of where your doctor is coming from, your clinician's coming from, in addition to what you want to cover, I think it just lends itself to this a higher vibe, to use a little bit of a woo-woo term, but that can feel really good and like you're able to cover more ground as a result.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I had a male physician that I used to work with. I won't say his name because people that used to work with me would know exactly what I'm talking about. But he used to say, "He who has the list is in control." And I didn't fully, as a new nurse practitioner, I did not fully understand that, but I grew to understand why he shared that with me. And it ties into your comment that you made about this kind of shared conversation was that if I could look at the list, then I had a sense of what was most important to the patient, but also gave me like a sense of like, maybe you need to come back in 2 weeks. Like maybe this needs to be a bigger conversation. I'm not negating the importance of these things. It's, we don't have enough time. And I had 30-minute appointments with my patients because they were just medically complex, but gives you a sense of what's important to the patient, may be very different than what you think is important. And so, when they would share the list, it gave you an opportunity to have some insights into like, where's their mindset? Like it could literally be, it's not that I'm not compliant. It's that I have to make decisions about paying for medications or buying groceries. Now, that changes everything. Like I'm just giving one example and I get chills thinking about it because I had a lot of patients that were just like, Cynthia, the medications I was put on in the hospital are too expensive. And I was like, okay, we need to find a solution. So I think in many instances, it can be an improvement in the quality of the relationship between the provider and the patient, but also gives you some insight into what's most important. And it could be completely different than what the clinician is thinking is important to you. Now, you did a really beautiful job talking about the microbiome in the book, and this is a huge focus of my interest and work. And so, like, from your writer's vantage point, when we talk about the microbiome and the estrobolome and inflammation and mood and all these things and how they're interconnected, what feels truly solid to you in terms of information versus what's like newer and more emerging?
Yeah, I think from my vantage point, it's going back to the basics. For me personally, after I worked on that chapter, I am focused on as much fiber as I can get. The conversation right now is all about protein, which I know is really important, and so many of us aren't getting as much as we need. But man, I am looking to try to get fiber every time I put something in my mouth because it's that important for our gut bugs. And I think that I was also just blown away by really what we are starting to know for sure about the microbiome is really, it is as crucial as experts say it is. It is as big of a game changer as you've heard when it comes to our overall health, and how much we know it does. And then my sense is, gosh, we probably have only really scratched the surface. We are going to be hearing more and more in the coming years about how miraculous that army of bugs that live in and on us are.
Yeah, I love that. And for listeners, I did not know that was what you were going to say, Megan, about fiber. I jokingly now call it the other F word because it is so polarizing. My new book is called the Menopause Gut, and so I talk about the role of fiber and why it's so important, especially as we have all these changes in the estrobolome and the microbiome in the setting of alterations in estrogen in particular. And for me, it's amazing to me when I reflect back on like key times in my life when I did not tolerate fiber and what did it demonstrate. Now I understand. It was like there was a lot going on in the gut that I was not addressing, whether it's you get a round of antibiotics or whatever it is. But I think we're just starting to understand that fiber is more than just bulking our stool. It is far more, it's like signaling molecules and information and food for, colonocytes. And so I think that fiber is one of these things that is polarizing, but also important to understand that it has this significant role. And I will just say that there's a very wonderful podcast host who I've been a guest on her podcast, and she said, I'd love to bring you back, but we can't talk about fiber because in my community, fiber is like sacrosanct. And so I jokingly now have been saying like fiber is the new F word, that it's that polarizing for people to consider and talk about. And so I love that you brought up fiber because I do think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, and actually, that kind of makes me sad because really, again, I interviewed multiple experts for this book and for each chapter, and pretty much everyone in the gut health chapter said fiber is great. I'm thinking of a dietitian, dietitian Ashley Koff. She's a registered dietitian, and she says, fiber, yeah, but she tries to personalize it. And so she says, look, you also have to understand and clue into what all that fiber is doing. So if you're just loading on fiber into a body that's not processing it well, then there's going to be some downstream impacts of that. And I think that speaks to the importance for all women to like understand, again, track your symptoms, understand that you are a little N of one study. And so what is the fiber, upping your fiber intake, actually, what is it looking like for you? And then talk to an expert, like a dietitian, like your, go-to healthcare practitioner, to really go into all the details about what that is doing to you versus just following advice willy-nilly.
Yeah, and the power of the N of one. Like if you are currently consuming a standard American diet, you're probably getting at most 5 to 10 grams a day. And if you suddenly try to go from that to 40, guess what? You're going to be bloated. You're going to be unhappy. You may get constipated, which we know is not a good thing. And so I think that, in a lot of different levels, I agree with Ashley, and certainly kind of identifying this kind of personalized approach. It could be quantity. Like maybe you tolerate half a cup of Brussels sprouts and not 2 cups. Like I love Brussels sprouts to the point where anytime my husband makes them, I'm like, I just eat far too many. But I acknowledge that it's the N of one. Like you can have a cup, but you can't have 3 cups. And so you probably need to not be gluttonous. To kind of round out the conversation today, if a listener is dealing with things like brain fog and GI symptoms and maybe new onset anxiety in their 40s, what new rules would you want her to hear first from this conversation, or to think about? Obviously, your book is an incredible resource.
I think first and foremost, your story about what's happening to you matters. Believe yourself. Believe that you're worth unpacking some of those symptoms with an expert who can potentially help you. And even first, like just talk about it with your girlfriend or your partner or your kids, whoever feels like a safe person in your life, because I think too often we just go on with life and we say, I'm dealing with brain fog, or my gut is off, or I'm not sleeping well anymore. And we just shrug our shoulders and get on with it. I think women in midlife right now have been taught the very clear message from our young lives, like buck up, buttercup, just get on with it. And sure, we can still be tough while also giving voice to the things that are like don't feel so great. So rule number one, write down what you're dealing with and talk to somebody about it, and believe that you're worth talking about those things with.
I so love that message. Such an important one. Meghan, please let listeners know how to connect with you outside of the podcast or get access to your new book.
Yes, you can get my new book at newrulesofwomenshealth.com. You can learn a little bit more about me there as well, and find my articles in magazines and on Maria Shriver's weekly digital news magazine, The Sunday Paper. And yeah, I'm just so excited for readers to hopefully, learn from this book and also use it as that reference to be able to take care of themselves, their families, and also get the care that they really, truly deserve.
Oh, such exciting times. Thank you again for your time today. Hey, if you like this video, you guys are going to love this video, and I'll see you there.
You have either uncontrolled diabetes, and this goes for type 1, type 2, LADA, MODY, any form of diabetes. If you follow the standard, if you follow no advice, you're probably going to hasten your death even more than 3.5 years for each decade you have it. But if you follow the standard advice, the state-of-the-art advice, the scientific consensus advice, then yeah, you're probably going to be knocking 3.5 years off your life for every decade that you follow the American Diabetes Association recommendations.